Hey there, everyone. Today I would like to provide a deep dive into the first chapter of Joyce's Finnegans Wake. My aim is that this being one of my favorite chapters of the book, I think it's one of the funniest chapters in all of literature too, I really want to show this as an approachable overture to the text. That while Joyce did advocate the ability of the reader to start at any point of the text and enjoy it and glean something from it, I think it's clear that the first chapter serves as a sort of overture, even more so the first page, in which we see most of the themes of the book condensed into 3 short paragraphs, really 2.5 short paragraphs. And I think what's really interesting about the book as a whole, and I think we're going to see this as we move through this first chapter, is that it is uniquely suited to accommodate unique acts of reading, to accommodate and furnish unique reading contexts, unique strategies for approaching the text, unique mindsets that we have each time we come to the text anew, and it offers us a space by which to really broach into some of the most fundamental questions of philosophy and literature. Questions of history, of verisimilitude, of the nature of truth, of narrativity, of discursivity, of experimentation, of literary form, of the nature of speech and language. All of these are some of the key themes of the first chapter. And in this lecture, I would like to first kind of give you a brief overview of what's going on here, and then I will go into my detailed notes that I took on this chapter. I think the best way to describe this opening chapter is a framing piece without a center. We have loose invocation of certain characters which seem to form certain complexes together. We have Finn McCool, we have HCE, we have Jarl von Huther, we have all of these male characters which seem to form some kind of connection with each other. Then we have ALP, we have Kate, we have Biddy Doran the hen, we have the Prank Queen. All of these characters are to varying degrees major and minor characters, and in this first chapter they are put into such an extreme degree of confluence that it's really in many ways an anti-overture, even though we're being introduced to the characters, because we are not given some sort of external frame of reference by which to situate these characters in a steady hierarchy. Instead, they flow in and out of each other to such an extent that really ALP's flowering rivers become the texture of the entire book. And we vacillate in between that flowing, sort of streaming along of the text, and then these punctuated moments of onomatopoeia, of alliteration, of aggressive punctuation and interjection of voices. And really the polyvocality of this chapter is one of the things that makes it so difficult. But to kind of go for a broad summary, on the opening page we have this overture where we are shown the sleeping giant Finn McCool as the body of Dublin and of Ireland itself. We are also introduced to a sort of cascading view of history where history has always already began and is always already ending and going out. So there's this duality of arising, which is always premature, and yet which is always not yet. It has yet to happen. It has yet to fully come to fruition. And at the same time, it is always already fading out, always already trickling, and like we're at the very last embers of a fire. And we can see this duality in the word wake in Finnegans Wake, because a wake is a funeral, which is really interesting because at a funeral, someone is not waking up. Metaphorically, they are going to sleep forever, never to wake again. And yet, Joyce was fascinated by the Irish-American ballad Finnegans Wake, Finnegans with an apostrophe S, which notably Joyce's title does not have. And in the song Finnegans Wake, Tim Finnegan is a bricklayer, and in order to help him on his way to work each morning. He has a drop of the crather. He has some porter, some kind of alcoholic beverage, and one day he climbs a ladder and he's drunk, and he falls from the ladder, breaks his skull, and his friends all carry him to his own wake. And they dress him up real nicely, and they're all crying, and then they start getting into some commotion. We might say this is a commodious vicus, as the first page would put it. And at that moment, alcohol starts being thrown around, and some of it hits Tim Finnegan, and Tim Finnegan rises, and he says, "Toast to the devil, did you think I was dead?" Basically, I don't even really know a literal translation of the Irish here, but he's like, okay, well, just keep doing your thing. I've risen, thanks to Porter. And Joyce thought this was really interesting because in many ways it's a sort of mock resurrection story. It's a humorous, comical, really farcical version of Jesus's resurrection, where instead of being resurrected by some sort of holy force from on high, it is the lows that it's literally poison that we put into our bodies and that we tolerate in, at least usually, small amounts. And Joyce is so interested by this song, and we really see it acting as one of the sort of central sonic and narrative textures of this opening chapter. There are going to be moments where some of the lyrics from the song interject, and we gradually follow this male figure, Finn McCool, HCE, Mr. Earwicker, Mr. Porter, whatever we want to call him. He has a bunch of different names throughout Finnegans Wake. He is gradually going to fall from his ladder, fall from the great graces of the tremendous accomplishments of historical figures. So we have all of these figures like the Duke of Wellington being invoked and all of their battles that they've accomplished. And Tim Finnegan is falling from these graces, and he is falling into bed. And the thing that Joyce does that is very different from the Irish ballad is that instead of being wakened, we end the chapter with him being soothed back to sleep after he is awakened by the people at his wake. So there's a persecution narrative going on here. Instead of everyone wanting him to wake and celebrating his wake, which incidentally, he's doing the opposite of what you would normally do at a wake, even though it's called a wake. Instead of that happening, they want to lull him back to sleep. They tell him, it's okay, it's going to be much more complicated, the world is crazy, just go back to sleep, it would be easier. So really, this is a sort of framing narrative of sin and persecution, and also of desire, because there are numerous sexual innuendos going throughout this chapter, and there are throughout the whole book. This is a very sexual book, but they're all hidden under so many idioms and so many different vernaculars that it can be very difficult to pick these out. But I'll give you some instances of that where we can really see this layered sexual imagery going on. And not until the very last paragraph of this opening chapter do we get the word insectuous, which this is one of the key sort of reversals that goes on in Finnegans Wake, is insect becomes incest and incest becomes insect. So as a way for HCE to deal with the possibility of his incestuous actions or thoughts or expectations, the characters turn into insects. So this is a psychological defense mechanism, right? A way of protecting himself against the reality of his thoughts by disavowing those thoughts and by shifting the burden and the content of those thoughts. But the form of the thoughts is what is most interesting, the way that the characters react to these thoughts. And we see this, for example, in one of the later chapters, not very far from this first chapter, in which HCE encounters the cad in the park. And the cad in the park asks HCE what time it is. And for some odd reason, HCE interprets this as an attempt to indict him of his crime. He sees this as a persecutory gesture, which it's like totally, it wouldn't be in daily life. But this is dream logic. So strange things can invoke strange responses, precisely because everything can be a veiled reference to something else. And Joyce really wants to challenge the idea of a primacy of reference. He wants to acknowledge the fact that utterances can be at once sexual and political and familial and literary and mythic and religious. He wants to challenge the idea that one of these has to be primary or essential or what's really going on. And in this way, Joyce is anti-Freudian. He's not trying to figure out what is really going on in the unconscious. He's trying to figure out the way that the unconscious responds to its structures of coping, the way that it co-opts the stuff of the world, turns it into myth, turns it into narrative, turns it into story, turns it into fiction. And Joyce really wants to challenge the idea in this chapter that history and fiction can be meaningfully separated from each other. Joyce says famously in Finnegans Wake, every telling has a tailing. Right? So every telling of facts, every tabulation of a list of empirical matters is at once and is irrevocably connected to the spinning of a tale. Right? The fictionalization of that thing and incorporating it into a system which coheres together. Because empirical facts on their own don't speak on their own. We have to make them speak through words. And the idea of the word is super important for Joyce. It's perhaps one of his most important preoccupations. And most importantly, he's concerned with the written and the spoken word. So rather than thinking about the word in some sort of abstract, either literary sense or theological sense, right, like the logos, Joyce wants to think about it in its performed aspects as speech and as its archaeological aspects, as a artifact left on the page in the form of writing, right? Because we can open up Finnegans Wake and we can see writing on the page. So this is some sort of enduring artifact. But Joyce wants to really question the idea that artifacts only hide one thing. He really wants to focus on the enveloping facts, as he puts it, and show that the form, the garb in which reality is clothed is just as important as what is revealed. And hence, one of the erotic implications of Finnegans Wake we can see in the overwhelming recurrence of a fetishizing of female panties. And this is a fetish that Joyce actually had. And one of the sort of aesthetic things that he does with that is to show that perhaps the clothing is more erotic than what it hides. That hiding is its own form of revealing. And hence, in a way, this first chapter is a revelation of a conception of history, but a conception which goes beyond one concept, and hence it evokes a number of different narratives. So we have the mute and jute sequence. This is an interaction between two people, mute and jute, who have some trouble understanding each other. They don't seem to speak a common language, and their dialogue seems to be irrevocably shaped by the shavings that occur between their utterances. We also have the Prank Queen episode. We also have the Musy Room episode. And then we also have the lulling of HCE back to sleep, and then we have the very end of the chapter, which ends on a sort of cliffhanger as to whether or not all this hubbub that goes on in Edinburgh will be fixed. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, Finnegans Wake is uniquely suited to accommodate unique reading acts. And therefore, this means the preoccupations and concerns of its readers. And therefore, I think it's important that I be forthright about the kinds of things that I was looking for and that also caught my eye this read-through. Now, I'm particularly interested in reading Finnegans Wake as a postmodern text, of reading it in light of postmodern theory and reading it as a precursor to and implicated in a lot of the development of postmodern theory. So I'm really interested in the way that Finnegans Wake talks about self-reflexivity, about discursivity, about historicity, about ground and truth and aleatoriness. I'm also really interested in the nature of sound and speech in Finnegans Wake. How does it, therefore, emblematize and lionize and explicate the nature of speech and the performance of unique speech acts? I'm also interested in the way that unique voices interject into each other, and the way that this is signaled by certain punctuation conventions, and by the way that oftentimes we have a mix between a sort of flowy mode of connection and then an articulated interruption or breaching of voices into each other. Therefore, it really is the nightmare of history that Stephen speaks of in Ulysses made manifest. And speaking of Stephen, this first note that I have here is concerning an utterance that is echoed by Stephen in Ulysses. Stephen talks about help my unbelief. And the idea of belief is really interesting for Joyce. And in the midst of a dining scene, they're doing a prayer. And Joyce writes, "For what we are, if we are about to believe." Right? So instead of asking for supplication for whatever we are about to believe, we instead call into question the very nature of belief and ask if we are even about to believe. So this gifts a gross is an interjection that splits off and corrects the initial phrasing, which if we connected that, it would be what we are about to believe. But instead, what we are is changed to if we are about to believe. So it's not so clear whether or not, just as Stephen doesn't believe his own theory of authorship and originality in Ulysses, so too it's unclear to what extent we are supposed to believe Finnegans Wake, whether or not it's the type of text that even is supposed to be believed, as if the goal is to reach some sort of truth below it. Finnegans Wake really questions the primacy of any one level of meaning, and instead asks that really we don't need to believe the text, we just need to experience it. It's not a matter of truth or falsity, it's a matter of effects and moving. It's a matter of introducing certain discourses, practices, and strategies and seeing how they can test each other. And one of those examples here is Grandpa Puss has fallen down, but Grinny spreads the board. And I see this as an attempt for a male voice, probably HCE, who has fallen from his graces to comfort himself by saying, okay, well, Grandpa, he's fallen down, but at least he's not as bad as Granny, because Granny, she spreads the whole board. And if we think about the male and female characters of Finnegans Wake, the male principle tends to be the obstinate stone principle, whereas the female is the fluid water principle. So this is really describing the topology or topography of the earth, right? Grandpa, the earth, the land, he's fallen down. But that's just a small portion of the globe. The whole board is covered by water. So at least it's not as bad as being totally fallen, totally spread out like Granny is, like the water is. And then what's really interesting is we have this invocation of the Duke of Wellington as we enter the Musy Room. And the Musy Room sequence is one of the funnier ones where we're just going through this museum, which is dedicated to the Duke of Wellington, to Napoleon, to a number of other kind of warlords, including Genghis Khan. And first we are introduced to Wallenstone, and then that becomes Willingdon, which is really interesting because first we have the obstinate principle of history, which is a sort of wall in a stone. So it's like, even within the stone of history, we dig in and we try to find something. And what do we find? Another wall. And that becomes Willingdon. And I think of thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, right? So this is a sort of invocation that someone's will be done. But we don't really know who it is because someone is redismembered here, right? So there's a dismembering of style again and again that is happening, that is fragmenting the ability to find some locus of authority for whose will is going to be done. And really, all we get is the proliferation of narratives of stories without a center. And one of these is the Russian general. So Buckley is an Irish soldier who is fighting in the Crimean War, and he sees a Russian general and he has him in his sights and he's about to shoot him, and then the Russian general starts to take a shit. And out of the kindness of his heart, Buckley says, okay, I'm not going to shoot him yet. But then he sees him take a sod of turf and wipe his ass with it. And at that moment, Buckley decides to shoot the Russian general. And we get this story proliferated throughout Finnegans Wake. But this is the first instance we get of it. This is the bullet that banged the flag of the Prussians. This is the French that fire on the bullet that bang the flag of the Prussians. And there's an interesting thing going on here. So we have this French, and the French here is a gun. It is a French gun. And the Prussians becomes Prussian, becomes Russian. So, by extension, the Prussians is a reference to the Russian general, who is shot in the flag by a Frenchman or by a French gun. And the flag here, I think, is an innuendo for his penis, right? So instead of what we would imagine is he's shot in the ass because that's what's out when he's going to the bathroom, the implication is that, in fact, the bullet traveled in between his legs and hit him in his penis. Now we get an instance of incest being alluded to here. This is Bode Belgium, bonnet to Busby, breaking a secret word with a ball up his ear to the Willingdon. Right? So bonnet to Busby is the key part here, which bonnet would seem to be a daughter, right? Or some kind of young woman who's adorned or clothed with a bonnet, and then the Busby would be the husby or the husband, which would be HCE, who is breaking his secret word, right? This is the sort of secret sin, kind of like Paul in the Bible. And he's doing this near the Wellington Monument, which, of course, is a large phallic monument itself, and it comes to represent the sort of latent sexual capacity in Finnegans Wake, especially of the male characters. And then down below this, we get some interesting terms that are referenced that seem to really foreground the nature of performance and of play. So we have a reference to mistletoes, right? So tropes, literary tropes. Then it says bull's ear, play. So it says bullseye, but instead of focusing on the eye, we're focusing on the ear, the way that sound assails the ear, and the way it plays, and therefore the way that we play with action and their mobily, right? The way that they are mobily mobile. Again, a reference to Buckley shooting the Russian general. Basukur Usted, this is the do for him sea boy. Blow the whole of the half of the hat of Napoleon's off of the top of the tail on the back of his big white horse. Tip! Bullseye! Game! Right, so that tip is like the sound when you're like in a carnival and the bullet hits where it's supposed to go and it makes a little bell sound, right? So that's like the ding, and we have a bullseye because we have hit, once again, the flag of the Russian general. And then below that, high down a down. This is a sort of classic postmodern invocation of the high and the low, the high and the down, right next to each other that's so interesting to me. And Finnegans Wake celebrates the low. It says, we wish for a muddy kissmans to the minutia workers. Right, so this is a book dedicated to the lowly, to the workers who do the minute things, not necessarily the Weltgeschichte-Personen, as Hegel would put it, the world historical persons like Napoleon. No, it's dedicated to the little people who sing the day we sally bright. Right, so there's that invocation of song and therefore of sound that I'm so interested in. We have a reference to the fairest sin the sun saw. That's Circe. And especially this parenthetical interjection is really interesting because this could be a curse, it could be Circe as in certain, or it could be Curse the tailor, who is part of the Norwegian captain sequence. He's trying to make an outfit for the Norwegian captain, but the Norwegian captain is too fat, and they get into an argument about this. And then one of the things that also we see since this is all about narrative and history, is the nature of originality, the kind of bringing focus to the actual act of telling history. So we have reference to steal and our midst of debt. So, right, every historical telling and its tailing is really stealing stuff from somewhere else, something that has happened and is, trying to duplicate it in some way, at least ideally. And this creates a sort of debt to our past. And this is the debt to the father that the younger boy characters have throughout. Another interesting fact here is it says, that's what makes life worth leaving. So instead of life worth living, now it's life work, which is leaving. And I think what Joyce is saying here is that living is always a leaving. Through our work, we are alleviating our suffering, and we are also leaving our place of birth, our place of home. We are moving into something new, and therefore Finnegans Wake wants to valorize digression and ambulatoriness and rumor. He says, let young women run away with the story, and let young men talk smooth behind the butler's back. Right, so we say, I know that people are going to talk behind my back as an author, that they're going to talk behind the backs of each of the characters. And there's an invocation, because of all this contestation by the different characters, which are just sort of proliferating instantly when we open up this book, there's an invocation of perspective, that every crowd has its several tones, and every trade has its clever mechanics, and each harmonical has a point on its own. Right? So each has a different way of assailing different perspectives. Every crowd has several different tones, right? So it's not univocal. It doesn't speak in one voice. It speaks in multiple voices. Every trade has its clever mechanics. We might say that this is really talking about discourse itself, right? These clever mechanics are the tools of the trade. They are the strategies and the tactics by which some trade or some discourse works. And each harmonical, right? Think of like the harmonic series. There's a certain frequency at which you can make something vibrate and it will resonate with another body with the same resonant frequency. And speaking of frequency, here's an invocation of sound sense. This is a sort of topic that Joyce is always playing with in Finnegans Wake, which is the teetering of language in between sound and sense. He says, behove this sound of Irish sense. Really? Here English might be seen. Royally? One sovereign pun to pettery pence. Regally? The silence speaks the scene. Fake! Right? So we have an attempt with that interjection of fake to try to discount this sound sense. But really, as soon as we say to behove this sound of Irish sense, it's questioned whether or not it's purely Irish. Because, the interesting thing is Joyce is not writing in Irish as an Irish author. He's acting through the perspective and speaking as an Englishman. So of course English might be seen. There's going to be probably more English than Irish. So there's one sovereign who is always punning his poetry. And that is his pence. That is his penance that he is paying to us. Therefore the silence speaks the scene. And I take that to say that really what is more important in Finnegans Wake, as is the case with real life, is what is not said. That which cannot be said because it is marginal and it has been excluded from the dominant discourse. And Joyce really wants to explode discourse by hyper-compacting it and by accreting discourses together. So, for example, we get this word musical, which is a mix between magic and music. So there's an attempt again for sound, for listening, and for the remains to speak out. We have a reference to listener, to hear, to list, to a lyre, to listening, to the harp's discord. So it's filled here with references, especially in this kind of paragraph or two, with invocations of music. We have a reference to a pen no weightier. And I think that this is Joyce saying that his pen doesn't intend to weigh or to evaluate. His purpose here is not to give us some sort of moral lesson, to be a moralist here. No, his pen is to deliver us experiences where the onus of valuation is on the structures that we share with Joyce, the structures of our own, and also the choices that we make as interpreters to weigh certain things above others, to put this play into something stable. And it's really interesting because Finnegans Wake is really always talking about itself being living, and therefore always evading this sort of attempt to systematize. It speaks of the leaves of the living in the bulk of the deeds, annals of themselves, timing the cycles of events, grand and national, bring fossil-wise to pass how. Right, so we are bringing fossils to pass precisely by leaving them in a living book of deeds. Right, a book here which is about a bloke, which is telling annals about itself. It is concerned not only with the content of the telling, but of the very nature of telling itself. Now, another instance that we seem to get of, at the very least, intergenerational relationships between an older man and a younger girl is here. A brazen-locked damsel grieved sobre las solas because that puppet, her minion, was ravished of her by the ogre Poripus Pius. Bloody wars in Balia Cleebally. Right, so there at the end, we get balaclava and Buckley put together. So we have the aggressor and the one who's aggressed against squished together as male figures and put against the female figure, who is literally put underneath the male figure. And notably, I believe that she is being fucked here on her period. Hence, it is a bloody war, right? So she's ravished by an ogre who is supposedly pious, and yet he's defiling this young girl, and considering it's called a bloody war, it doesn't sound like it was consensual to me. Next, we get an invocation of a new alter ego for Shem and Sean in the guise of Caddy and Primus. First, right, on the first page, they were Gem or Shen, brewed by Arclight. Now they're Caddy and Primus, and Primus was a santry man and drilled all decent people. Caddy went to Winehouse and wrote a piece of farce, blotty words for Dublin. Right, so here Primus is Sean, because Sean is a sentry. He's a drill sergeant here, and he drills decent people. He makes people decent through the invocation of the moral voice. These are all classic traits of Sean, of being the authority figure. And then Caddy, as Shem, goes to the wine house, like his father does, who is a bartender, and he writes a piece of farce. And farce is one of the kind of overarching modes of Finnegans Wake. No mode has absolute primacy, but farce is one that continues to come back and to define the Wake in scholarship. So these blotty words for Dublin, right? These are both blotting out the crime by repressing it and by disavowing its original content and placing it under new guise. And it's also adding blots to the page, actually telling a story. And of course, the problem is the copyist must have fled with his scroll. So the original copyist, the person who was supposed to be copying history as it really is, seems to have fled. So our locus of authority seems to be somewhere else. And therefore, what do we have in its place? In the stead of the subject who would authorize our history, we have earth spake and we have scribicide. These are perfect words for describing Finnegans Wake. It is earth speak, but it has spake, just as, right, we have thus spake Zarathustra. So this may be a subtle reference to Nietzsche's text. And then also we have scribicide, right? So scribbling genocide, right? So we are using scribbles, so not proper writing, to really do a death blow to the idea of the purity of language. In place of representation and optocentrism, we have sound-focused explication of experience, of affect. Therefore, he says, clear lift we our ears, eyes of the darkness. So we see here once again that Finnegans Wake evokes and invokes the ear. It also invokes happiness and laugh tears, right? So you're laughing so hard that you cry. It's made of all smiles. And yet a confusium holds them. In hymns, in songs, It hummed. It is our attempt to reign in the chaos of the confusion, to hold on to something through hymns or songs. The way that in the refrain chapter of A Thousand Plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari talk about housewives who hum to take account of their busy day and to sort of add some sort of stability, or the way a child in the dark hums a song to make themselves not feel so alone. Joyce asks in this parenthetical interjection, "Isn't it the truth I'm telling you?" Which is notably a line from the ballad Finnegans Wake. But it's a question. It's a proper question. It's questioning the very mode of truth. Is it the truth that is being told? Now, as we approach the mute and jute dialogue, we have a queer sort of man who is invoked, right? So someone who is either queer in the sort of modern sense, we could interpret it as that, or in the older sense. But it says, "lest we overstep," which could be "lest we overstep," as in we don't want to be queer, or asking us that we should overstep. Let's overstep. Let's transgress. And as they enter their dialogue, they're trying to figure out if they speak the same language, and, well, he says, "Oh, 'tis a jute," right? It's a mute, which is funny because in him trying to demean jute as a mute, really he's indicting himself because his own name is mute. So he is already what he is condemning in someone else. He just tries to deny it by using the voice of authority. A mute says he is only an utterer. And I take this as a sort of false invocation of humility, that I only utter what is proper. He says, "I became a stummer." And I think of here the German word stimmen, which is to tune. Like if I tune a piano or a violin, I invoke stimmen. So here we are trying to tune in language to two different frequencies, invoking two different subjects and trying to get them on some sort of common path. And this results in a language that is on the edge of tolerability. Therefore, you that side your voice are almost inedible to me. So instead of inaudible, it's inedible, unable to be ate, to be stomached. And what does this lead to? It leads to hesitancy. And both mute and jute invoke different spellings of the word hesitancy. And this is very important because this is a reference to the famous Parnell trial, where he is assumed to be in some very bad political dealings, and Parnell is exonerated when they figure out that, in fact, it is one of his friends who has been writing these letters, and they know that because they ask him on the stand, his friend, to spell hesitancy, and he spells it incorrectly, as he did in his letters too. So the very misspelling of the word hesitancy, this sort of lacunae in language, becomes the site by which to indict someone of a crime. So there's a gap and an elision here that testifies to what is not spoken. And therefore there's an invocation also of censorship or repressing, our wrong story shortener. Right? So maybe this is the wrong story is being told and we're trying to correct it by shortening it, or this is we're trying to tidy it up. We're trying to make it seem more pretty than it actually is. And this is the question in Finnegans Wake. How bad is the crime really? Because it could be a number of things. It could be HCE happens upon two girls peeing in the park. It could be that he pees in the park in a bush. It could be that he stumbles upon two women and three soldiers having sex, or that he engages in this orgy with them. Or, most problematically, it could be his either sexual fantasies or his actual sexual past and history with his own daughter, Izzy. So therefore, there's always a sense of, okay, well, how bad is this story really? And therefore, how hard are the characters having to work to overcome this struggle and to repress desire? So, right, this text is deeply invoking psychoanalytic discourse. Jute speaks of a weird from Sturk to Finnick. And in Old English, werden means to destroy or to violate. right? So this is a really radical passage here, that from start to finish, Finnegans Wake is a destruction, a violation of purity, a violation of bodies, of discourses, of sources of authority, through rumummer, right? The murmur of rumor, and also of the ruh, which is Arabic for soul, right? So this is a sort of a baseline excitability of the human person, of the individual, to express themselves in surgens, right? In surges. But this is not going to be used to privilege some sort of subject who oversees history. Instead, likes equal to an equal in this sound symmetry, which is Liebes love. So here, like is equal to its unequal when we're invoking sound. There is no implicit hierarchy that is required a priori. Instead, we have the flattening of hierarchies through the invocation of sound, through Liebes, so love, right? And we get an interesting little instance of a sort of phenomenological inquiry when Finnegans Wake speaks of in the ignorance that implies impression, that knits knowledge, that finds the name form, that whets the wits, that conveys context, that sweetens sensation, that drives desire, that adheres to attachment, that dogs death, that bitches birth, that entails the ensuance of existentiality. So if we thread this together, we start with ignorance and we end with existentiality. Which, if we're thinking about this in the Heideggerian sense, this is a unique horizon for being that Dasein has, precisely because it is oriented towards being, towards the Sein, in the mode of questioning. So here we have an ignorance, a fundamental gap or lack or opening in all things, that is the inability to account for everything with a knowledge or truth-centered discourse, right? Because nature is not true or false. It just is. So in a way, we are ignorant of nature, even when we're deeply engrossed in it, because we're not concerned with knowing it. We're just experiencing it. So from this ignorance, this implies, right? This sort of naturally leads to impressions. And from these impressions, this is empiricism, it knits knowledge. And through this knowledge, we find a name form. So we are both creating a name form and we are searching out and finding, going on a quest to find a name form. Which I think this is interesting because here, a name is not necessarily a designation, but it is a form, an imposed structure on impressions, on the world. And this whets the wit, right? Just like we whet our appetite. This therefore conveys contacts. It allows us to feel a sense of being connected to other things, to being in contact with the world. And this only sweetens sensation more because we feel like we're in contact with something that can now drive our desire thoroughly, that can whet our desires. And therefore this leads to attachment, which is an adherence to entities. But this dog's death, and here the way that dog's being used, this is very interesting, right? It's a verb here, to dog. And it bitches birth. So dog and bitch is connected because, of course, bitch is a female dog. So death and birth are put right next to each other as two sort of warring parts of the horizon for being that is existentiality. And all of this world that is being described with this phenomenological inquiry is queer, and it continues to be quaky. It is an ear share. Right? So the ear is sharing the space with the world. Because rather than trying to dominate it, the ear has to participate. It has to convey. It has to imply, instead of stating, demanding, or superseding. And Finnegans Wake is fundamentally comedic, because at the heart of comedy is the idea that things are funny because they upset and violate our expectations. And this language of violation, of upsetting, this is properly transgressive and farcical in a sense, because it can assail one. Think of the way that certain, especially conservative comedians, will use their jokes in order to reinforce bigotry, make it seem okay. And it can be so terribly, it doesn't even strike the people who are interested in and find that funny how problematic it is. But it strikes one who is opposed to it as a right go wrong. Right? The way to use laughter or laugh tears to err, to make a right impulse become bigotry, become wrongness. And Joyce says, what a nice old nest it all makes, a midden-hide hoard of objects. And I've always loved this passage because what's going on here is we are invoking the body. And you might ask, well, how are we invoking the body? Well, because in the act of writing this out orthographically, we've made it in such a way that to pronounce it, to speak it, is to speak as if our mouth is full of objects, potentially food, for example. Think of if you're trying to talk with your mouth full. What a nice old mess it all makes. Right? So it's almost like we're smacking our words, which smacking has both an aggressive, like militaristic connotation of like smacking someone in the face, but also has a sexual connotation, right? Like smacking someone's butt cheeks or something like that. And this is an epsiline, an obsolete epistle, a collection of obsolete epistles, we might say, which wobble wears. Now, we don't know where it's going, but these wares are wobbly. They are unstable. They are swarming in sneaks. So this is both swarming in snakes, but also sneaking, as in secrets, elisions, tricks. Joyce says, what a Neanderthal tale to unfurl. Right? So this telling of the tailing that's going on in Finnegans Wake is a tale partially about humans and our ancestry, hence the reference to Neanderthals here. But it also is meandering, and it is a tall tale that is unfurling downwards and outwards. We are taking the tallness and we are making it come clattering down. Therefore, he says, but the world mind is, was, and will be, writing its own runes forever. Man, on all matters that fall under the ban of our infra-rational senses. Right? So beyond rationality, we have a number of obliquely and tangentially related senses, like intuition, like imagination, like creativity, like audiation. And all of these different senses ensure that the world, mind you, is, was, and will be writing its own runes. So writing is at the very heart of the way that Joyce views the world. Hence, he speaks of the word press. And he asks, is there no virtue more an alcohoran? Right? So this is invoking a no longer virtuous Qur'an, which ran, as in flees, errs, participates in a process of différance, as Derrida would put it. Joyce writes, for that, the raped one warns, is what paper is made of, hides and hints and misses in prints, till you finally, though not yet end-like, meet with the acquaintance of Mr. Typus, Mistress Tope, and all the little tip-topies. I love this passage, because we have the raped one, in parentheses, as the subject who is speaking here. So this would be Izzy. This would be a young girl who says that this is what paper, but this might also be papier, so Poppy, so the father, is made of. And you can see that she corrects herself, because first she says mead of, and then she says made of. She just instantly goes in there and corrects herself. Hides and hints and misprints. This is the very essence of writing. This is what paper itself is made of. There's no prearranged sequence or necessity to the way you have to write paper. You can write whatever you want. And it's never end-like, right? Therefore, every word will be bound over to carry 70 top typical readings throughout the book of Dublin's Giant. So this is Dublin, but also double ends joined. Because, right, Finnegans Wake ends in the middle of a sentence and begins in the middle of that same sentence on the opposite end of the sentence. So it is two ends, double ends, joined. And it will bound to carry more meanings than we can imagine, right? 70 top tipsical. Top tipsical is not a numerological or a numeric distinction, right? So really, this is just saying that reading is going to always carry a lot of meanings. And Joyce wants to insist, and I think this is one of the most exciting things about Finnegans Wake, is that this book lives. It is like a living entity, and it changes each time we come back and read it. But look what you have in your hand self. The movables are scrawling in motions, marching all of them ago in pit-pat and zing-zang. For every busy earwig's a bit of a Tory tale to tale. Right? Look what we have in your hand self. This is the very book that is being held in the hand as we're reading. The movables, so think of movable type, is scrawling all over in motions which is marching, that's notably militaristic. So we're linking writing to the dissemination of military order. Think of the way that militaries come in, and then one of the chief ways that they impose their authority of their mother country is by instituting schools that will teach that language of that imperial power that's coming in. So this is all ways of talking about how language serves to enforce power. And also, there is always a strange sort of psychological defense mechanism going on whenever incest is brought up in the story, which is that the male voice who is trying to come up with defenses always wants to shift the burden of the blame to the woman. And I think this is a great example of Joyce showing the discursive practices that inform the relationships between men and women. The way that women are told to be meek and mild, and the implication or the sort of quiet part that isn't being said out loud is to be willfully vulnerable to exploitation. Therefore, made a man do. He was reverse aghast. This snaky woman, trippery, right? So we have trickery being invoked. We have the man was made to do something by a snaky or sneaky woman. So this is all ways of saying, oh, well, she actually tricked me into having sex with her, right? This is the sort of, I did not have sexual relations with that woman. But if I did, it was because she made me. Now we are introduced to another of our male characters, Jarl von Huther, who had his burnt head high up in his lamp house, laying cold hands on himself. Right? So this could be that he's trying to warm himself up, but as with many of the images here, this is a loose reference to masturbation, right? Laying hands on himself. And right after that, maybe as a sort of way to justify these thoughts, to say that, oh, I'm not alone, his two little Jimimies, cousins of Orn, Christopher and Hilary, were kick-a-heeling their dummy on the oilcloth floor of his homerai, castle and earthen house. Right? So kick-a-heeling their dummy on the oilcloth. What does kick-a-heeling mean here? It could mean that they're dancing. They could be self-pleasuring themselves. Here in the earthen house, so this could be the foyer. This could be a field. Right? Homerai, castle. This could be a number of different locations here, but we seem to have two girls that are either dancing or pleasuring themselves or, doing something to sort of comfort Jarl von Huther, who is laying cold hands on himself and is like, oh, what am I doing? And Jarl von Huther is having a conversation with the prank queen, and the prank queen keeps asking him this riddle. Why do I am a look-alike a poss of porter piece? And I've talked about this before. No scholar really knows what it means, and it keeps being invoked over and over each time it changes slightly. Why do I am a look-alike 2 poss of porter piece? Why do I am a look-alike 3 poss of porter piece? Right, so it keeps changing over and over. Each time it's a little bit different, so there's no sense of primacy that just because, for example, the first one is first, it's therefore the most authentic. No, we just have different utterances of it over and over. And Jarl von Huther seems to react with confusion, saying, shut! Like maybe this is him saying shit, but he sort of, takes this under and subdues it, and it becomes shut, as in him saying to shut her mouth. Hence, hand-worded her grace. This would be like putting his hand over her mouth so that she's not saying words. And we get this interesting invocation of a sexual scene. And this is one of the examples of the way that Joyce is always garbing his content in loose states of innuendo. And the prank queen went for her 40 years' walk in Turlmond, and she washed the blessings of the love spots off the Jiminy with soap Sulliver Suttles. And she had her 4 hours masters for to touch him his tickles, and she converted him to a one sure all good, and he became a looter man. So then she started to reign, and be red on, she was back again at Jarl von Huther's in a brace of samers, and the Jiminy with her in her pinafron, lace at night at another time. And where did she come but to the bar of his Bristolry? And Jarl von Huther had his Baron-los bruised heels drowned in his cellar malt, shaking warm hands with himself. So we can see that this could be a fantasy about the prank queen. And then at the end, we have this interjection that no, in fact, he's still just masturbating. He's still shaking warm hands with himself, as in lying cold hands on himself earlier. And that he's imagining her touching him and then raining, right? We can imagine what this is. And that she is coming to his bar, coming to him, coming for him. But then ultimately it seems that this is in fact an act of self-pleasure. And this turns a little sadomasochistic when we see punched the curses, touched him his tears, and she perverted him, right? So she perverts him by punching his curses, this could be his balls, and then touch him his tears, so touching him in such a way that it brings him to tears, perhaps through anticipation or pain or something like this. And after the second thunder word, we end the prank queen sequence. And that was the first piece of alliterative poetry in all the flamin' floody, flatuous world. Right? So this is self-flagellation that we've got going on here. Being told in an alliterative way, but also not explicitly through any one literary mode. It's everyday, right? It's not just the stuff of high literature, so to speak, but it is non-literary or alliterary, precisely because it's we've just been talking about masturbation and sexual fantasies. Once again, we have a different sexual fantasy going on. He would eavesdrip, right? So he's eavesdropping and perhaps he's dripping with excitement or with bodily fluids. In the process, bottles in the far ear, right? So maybe he bottles this up and imagines it in his ear. And we see Merc, his veils are darkling. This is a reference to I see through a glass darkly from the Bible. And this word is really telling. Abhears, right? So he doesn't hear properly. This is an exercise in mishearing, in mistranslation. That's really what makes Finnegans Wake so funny, is all the failures of translation, the inability to make plain vowels, as it says, right? To make vowels speak. Rather, vowels become a fetishistic disavowal, an attempt to hide ourselves from what we're really hearing. Now, we get a line from the ballad Finnegans Wake, Tonamandil, did you think I was dead? And here it's, Anamakandul, did you drink me doornail? So this is the same thing, and then how do we react? Now be easy, good Mr. Fenimore, sir, and take your leisure like a god on pension, and don't be walking abroad. Right, so telling him, don't walk around, just lie down, enjoy your leisure, don't do anything. This is how authority figures, for example, valorize death. So I think this is a sort of Nietzschean point here going on, where there are all these strategies that are used to make us give up our life in place of respecting authority figures. And therefore, when they say, you're better off, sir, where you are, prime sign in the full of your dress. Prime sign is really interesting because it seems that we are adding primacy to certain terms by designating away a hierarchy of signs, right? So we are coming up with a list of signs and attaching certain roles in a hierarchy, such as, for example, the fact that Tim Finnegan should be subservient. He should listen to these people who are telling him not to walk abroad, that you'd lose yourself in Heliopolis if you went through all these meandering roads. Now, this is a very interesting line in terms of its theological critique. The palm sweat on high is the mark of your monument. So, right, the palm sweat of on high, this would be God's palms sweating, right? His being nervous or anxious or concerned with us. This is the mark of your monument, of humans' monument, right? So the fact that God is so concerned in the Bible with human affairs that he needs us to only have sex in a certain way, only eat certain things, that we can't worship idols or something like that. All of this, God's palms sweating. And I think of, for example, the fact of God regretting that he had made humanity in Genesis, right? This is him sort of sweating at his own creation and being like, oh my gosh, this got way out of hand. It reminds me of Voltaire saying that, God is a comedian that we haven't learned to laugh at yet. I think that's what Joyce is trying to do, saying, well, look, we need to be laughing at God because this is a sign precisely that he is just a name, that he is a mark of our monument. He is a monument to what Nietzsche would say is our greatest failures, our greatest insecurities, our need to be assured. And instead, Finnegans Wake serves to make sure that you were undone in every point, and how to free was easy. That to free ourselves from the classical fetters of language is pretty easy. It's pretty easy to enjoy Finnegans Wake once you've done a little bit of research, to be okay with being undone at every point. And as we approach the end of the chapter, there's a vacillation between the capacities for Tim Finnegan to wake again, perhaps not even with the authority figures allowing it or sanctioning it, and the fact that he is dead right now and that he is being actively worked against. Hence he says, "For we have performed upon thee, thou Abraham nation, who comest ever without being invoked, whose coming is unknown." Right? So when will he be re-invoked? When will he come back? Well, he will invoke himself at a time that we don't really know. But most importantly, this resurrection narrative that I just said, that has been performed upon Finnegan, right? So it's not an inherent aspect of things, but rather this is something that we performatively invoke as the work of thy tombing, right? So actively entombing the past, actively think of like the embalming process that goes into creating a mummy, right? This is the work of tombing. It is labor. It is an act. And reading is an act. It is an attempt at the moment of reading to interpret and to box things in, to code things, to hierarchize things, linearize things. All of this is so it appeals to all of us, right? So instead of saying, so it appears to us, so it appeals to us. So every appearance that we see when we're reading is itself a rhetorical appeal, right? It is rhetorically inflected, and it appears to us in a particular way because we are in a particular perspective. Joyce writes, "'Tis really the truth." No, isn't it, Roman Patrick's? Right? So we immediately are calling truth into question, its uncertainty. Is really truth becomes, no, isn't it? So not it isn't, but it's a question. Isn't it the truth? I told you, lots of fun at Finnegans Wake. Right, we don't really know. Next, I think this is a thing that a lot of people don't recognize about Finnegans Wake, is it invokes and calls critical attention to the discourses that have subjugated women through patriarchy. For example, in the Bible, you are allowed to buy slaves from the nations around you, and you are allowed to marry them. After you've pillaged their cities, you can take the virgins for yourself, and then you can have sex with them, and you can marry them, because after you've had sex with them, you have to marry them, otherwise you've defiled them, and they won't be able to have future partners, because the patriarchal economy values female sexual purity. Hence, Finnegans Wake says, "When the right hand seizes what the love arm knows." This is a common idiom we have in both the Bible and the Quran. What your right hand seizes, or what your right hand knows, or what you hold with your right hand is what you own. It is your property. And what is your property? What you have seized by your love arm. In other words, what your lust has made you take and plunder. and you buy women as a consequence, right? So this is drawing explicit attention to sex trafficking, to the history of sex trafficking, which is, I think it's something that we never think about as being in Finnegans Wake. Hence, the book is making an cost of income out of the last of his lavings and riding a blue streak over his Boar's Day shirt. Right? So it is accosting or encosting us through the ink of writing and telling. From his leavings, from that which he has shirked, that men have shirked, right? All the things that they leave to others is left on the page, is left not covered over, but left out in the open for us. And this opens up a liminal space, which is typified by the night, where misties swaddle 'em, where mishes lodge none, where mysteries pour kind on. Oh, sleepy, so be yet. So this is both so be it, as in a final statement, and so be yet, as in it is yet to be. So we're in this weird space of contestation where things are happening and they are also yet to happen. I find this one word really interesting because it is a perfect portmanteau for explicating Deleuze and Guattari's concept of collective assemblages of enunciation. Share stutterers. Right, so Deleuze and Guattari have this idea that there are no individual subjects of enunciation. Enunciation only works by invoking an other, which has created for us and allowed us to fill in a discourse with expectations and to allow us and prompt us to speak in the first place. And here, share stutters is hearkening to that concept of collective assemblages of enunciation, but also collective assemblages of error, of stuttering, that these are also informed by common structures of speech. And here on page 28, we get some really interesting instances of different attempts to describe the artisanry of Finnegans Wake, of sewing a dream together, of decoying, right, of tricking us. It's an avalanche that blows no pussy food. If you only were there to explain the meaning, best of men, and talk to her nice of gild and silver, the lips would moisten once again, right? So if we could explain the meaning, it would titillate us. It would make our lips moisten. So this would seem to lend credence to the fact that what is being hidden is something sexual, right? And hence it titillates and allures through elusive meaning and excess. And we are reading her evening world here. Her being really interesting because it's always assumed that the male figure is primary in Finnegans Wake. But if we look on the first page, for example, River Run past Eve and Adams, not Adam and Eve's. Joyce explicitly switches it around because there's an actual place called Adam and Eve's in Dublin, but he switches it around to Eve and Adam. So Eve comes first. Now, you would think Eve wasn't created first, but she did sin first. So on the one hand, this is pointing towards the relevance and the primacy of sin and therefore repression in this narrative, but also an attempt to sort of deconstruct the binary that privileges men precisely by doing what Derrida does and flip the binaries around so that now we have the woman taking the primary role. Hence, we are reading her evening world. Because if we look at the letter in Finnegans Wake, which is a synecdoche of the whole book, we see that it has been written by Shem, delivered by Sean, and spoken by or delivered by ALP. So really, this is unmistakably her evening world because she's the one invoking it, making the word flesh. Hence, it is a world of ways. And this is such an important piece of information in Finnegans Wake. A world of ways is a very explicit way by which Joyce thematizes discursivity. It is a world of tactics, strategies, discourses, modes, acts. Not of truths or falsities, but of ways of being, right? Modes of invoking, of acting, of titillating. And then once again on page 29, we get a reference to the 3 lice nittle clinkers. So instead of nice little, it becomes lice nittle. So now it's like we have nettles of lice, which is kind of an disturbing image. And then the 2 twilling bugs and 1 midget pucil. So this is the sexual scene again, the 3 soldiers and the 2 girls. After that, we get a series of optocentric words, ever seen, saw, seeing, witness, frailly she's, right? So she sees. I think this is a way of showing the discursive value of visibility, as Foucault would say, that visibility is a trap. It is a way of trying to truncate this narrative and use eyewitness testimony. And eyewitness is very important there, right? I is in there. And also I as in the subject, I versus you. I invoke my personal eyewitness testimony to try to indict you. And this is an affront to the dreamer of Finnegans Wake, to the dreamers of Finnegans Wake. And hence, he is overseen as we thought him. In this time-colored place where we live in our parochial firmament, one tide on another. Right? So we're going up and down the tides of this wake, of the Dead Sea, dugong up dip dripping from his depths. Right? So this is the dripping succor of sin and of sexuality and of eroticism of the unconscious. And the male character, as we come to these last few sentences, seems to be inebriated. So both inebriated and unable to ebb. He is stuck and unable to properly float along this tide, going up and down its depths. Because what? He is insectuous from his nature. So there's that invocation of incest with the classical reversal of Finnegans Wake. And we see you may gauge after the bynames was put under him in lashons of language and totalizing him. So finally, we end on this cliffhanger where it's unclear whether or not Tim Finnegan is going to wake. And this act of valuation, of gauging, of putting bynames under him, right? Of furnishing him with lashons of language. So this is doing damage to him, violence, like lashes. It totalizes him. That yields his name. And as we know, HCE's name is not given to him by himself, but Humphrey Chimpton Earwicker is given that name because the king sees him trying to catch earwigs and therefore calls him Earwicker. So he's given his name by an other. This is like Lacan says, that language is the other's discourse. So that being said, that is the conclusion of this chapter. I hope this very, very deep dive has helped make sense of what's going on here and given you some kind of things to think about and some context and some overviews of the chapter. You can check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because it really helps me out and I really appreciate it, but no pressure. That's it for this lecture, and I'll see you in another one.